Mike pointed out in the beginning that I had said something Rashomon, the idea of the Kurosawa's looked into objectivity versus reality and so on. So the different stories. There were 5 people on that show. Anyway, I think of using the name Rashomon for the theme, but I thought that might not be so accessible to most people. So I talked with where is he? There he is. Mark Willis, and he said, "How about Through the Looking Glass?" So he's responsible. And he's the next storyteller. So Mark would do.
Good evening. Hey, y'all doing okay? So far, so good. You usually say that, don't you? Through the Looking Glass. And of course, Through the Looking Glass, on the other side of the looking glass is Lewis Carroll country. That's Wonderland. And whenever I think of the book Through the Looking Glass or Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, what I remember most, of course, is the characters. I remember Alice and the March Hare. I remember the Cheshire Cat and the Red Queen, and my favorite was the blue caterpillar with its hookah. Great characters. My story tonight is about a few characters that I met when I was working for a small daily newspaper in Northwest Florida. Now these characters are not nearly as bizarre as Carol's characters were, but I thought they'd be worth this story, and I hope at the end of the story you'll agree with me. Now, I was in my second year of university. This was probably 1975, my sophomore year. And I was changing majors pretty regularly, every quarter. Tried biology, didn't work. Forestry didn't work. So my latest major was journalism. And in the middle, or the mid-1970s, journalism was a popular major, partly because of the Washington Post reporters Woodward and Bernstein exposing the Watergate scandal, which eventually led to the resignation of a president. And they were considered folk heroes. And perhaps I had a daydream that I would become an investigative journalist. And so I signed up for journalism. Unfortunately, in my first quarter, I found the classes to be uninspiring. And I said, wait a minute. I want to know more about what being a newspaper reporter is before I really sign on for this. My university had an office. It was called the Cooperative Education Office. And what they did, they would pair a student with an industry or a business related to the student's major. So for example, an engineering student would go off and work with NASA. They had never dealt with a liberal arts major before, so it was a bit of a challenge. But they did find a small daily newspaper down in Northwest Florida to take me on. And that was the Playground Daily News. Northwest Florida. Northwest Florida, got the map in your mind? It's in the Panhandle. And it's called the Panhandle because it looks like the handle of a pan. Nothing really imaginative about that. In reality, it's not so much Florida as South Alabama. Religion, politics, very conservative area. But it has some of the most beautiful sandy beaches along the Gulf Coast. And so it was always attracting tourists. The name for the place, of course, was the Redneck Riviera. And this is where the Fort Walton Beach Playground Daily News was. And that's where I went. One of the first characters that I met there was the managing editor. His name was Morgan Little. He was a short, pudgy man, had a broad face that was strangely immobile. He seemed incapable of making any kind of facial expression. I didn't know what was happening, but I learned from another reporter that Morgan had had a terrible car accident. He had been drinking one night, had crashed into something. He went through the windshield, mangling his face. and the publisher of the newspaper, Scott Fisher, had paid for Morgan's plastic surgery, his reconstructive surgery. Now, the joke around the newsroom was that Scott really didn't like Morgan that much, so that he had kind of scrimped on the surgery. He'd gone the discount route, and Morgan had got kind of a bargain reconstructive surgery, and that's why his face was as it was. Morgan was not a great thinker. I think he had read one book in his life, and that was Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, which is a dangerous book to read, because Morgan took her philosophy to heart and was always pushing libertarian ideas on the newspaper reporters. Fortunately, he was pretty easy to ignore, Morgan was, because like the Cheshire Cat, he was always vanishing. He was seldom in the newsroom. He would come back late in the evening, 10 or 11, to make sure that the newspaper was put to bed, but the rest of the time he was out drinking somewhere. One of his favorite haunts was on the causeway over Cinco Bayo that led from Fort Walton Beach to Shalimar. And it was a burlesque house. You couldn't call it a strip club. It was a burlesque house because they had exotic dancers. And between the dance acts, they had comedians telling terrible jokes. And the name of this burlesque house was Carmichael's Academy of Cultured Anatomy. I gotta say it again. Carmichael's Academy of Cultured Anatomy. And I always thought whoever Carmichael was, he or she, they had a wonderful sense of humor. Anyway, Morgan would get us, after we had turned in our stories, and take us out to Carmichael's. And one night we were over there, and the top billed act for that night was an exotic dancer by the stage name of Chesty Morgan. And Chesty Morgan was billed as having the largest natural breasts in the world. Her measurements were given as 73, 32, 36. For those into the metric system, that's 185, 81, 91. Okay. Well, Chesty Morgan comes out on stage and she does her act, and interesting. This is not something you see every day. Can't really say that it was erotic, though. It was interesting. She leaves the stage, and now what she does next is even more interesting. She comes back onto stage. She's in a dressing gown. She asks them to turn on the house lights. She takes a chair. She sits on the edge of the stage, and she addresses the audience, and she says, "Do you have any questions you want to ask me?" Now, we didn't expect the exotic dancer to ask us to ask her questions, and so we all kind of stared down into our beer. And when there were no questions, she started talking about what it was like to live with her breasts. She talked about how all of her clothes had to be specially ordered, made. She talked about her back pains and carrying around the weight. And it was truly, truly a through-the-looking-glass moment. The managing editor, Morgan. Under him was the city editor, a man by the name of Gary Anderson. Gary was from Texas, but he wasn't a cowboy Texan. He was an Austin Texan. He was from the state capital. Very tall, thin. He had a very narrow face. It looked as though it had been put in a vise and squeezed, and a long nose that his horn-rimmed glasses sat on. Quite a good editor, very intelligent, had a very sharp wit. He never wanted to be the butt of Gary's jokes. He helped me a lot with my writing. One of the first things I had to do at the Playground Daily News was to write the obituaries. And this is not back-of-the-page economist obituary. The funeral homes would bring in the information, and I would type up who had died, their survivors, and when services would be held. And Gary would check my obituaries as if I was writing something for the Washington Post. And I always appreciated that. He was married, but unhappily. Instead, he was infatuated with the police reporter of the Playground Daily News, who sat at the desk next to his. Her name was Kathy Blum. And Kathy was in her mid-30s, rather tall, attractive. She had blonde hair that she wore very short, and tan. She was of that generation where getting out in the sun as much as you could was healthy. Gary, unfortunately, had no hope of any kind of relationship with Kathy, because Kathy, being the police reporter, only dated law enforcement officers. Fort Walton Beach policemen, Okaloosa County sheriff's deputies, Florida State Highway Patrol. And as she said, any man with a gun. So Gary was out of luck. Kathy viewed herself as being kind of an old-fashioned, hard-nosed, hard-boiled reporter. She chain smoked, she drank heavily, but to be truthful, we all drank heavily. My first day at the Playground Daily News, they took me out for lunch. We went to a local place called the Teepee. And this being Florida, it was in the shape of an American Indian teepee. And we drank pitcher after pitcher after pitcher of draft beer. I don't remember eating any food. So when I got back to the newsroom, this is my first day, I sat down at my desk and I looked at the two electric typewriters on my desk. One was real and one wasn't. And I spent most of that afternoon trying to determine which was the real object. Kathy, as I said, well, she saw something in me. She thought she could make me a reporter. She took me under her wing. She always had a police scanner going. And one night we heard that a taxi cab driver had been hijacked in Pensacola, which was to the west of Fort Walton Beach. And later that night, we heard that the Okaloosa County sheriffs had found the cab and also the cab driver in our county, and he had been murdered. And he had been dumped off of a state road in the northern part of our county. So Kathy told me to grab a camera. We got in her car, we drove up, off the state highway, off onto a county highway, off onto a dirt road, into this pine woods. And the deputies' patrol cars were lighting up the scene. In the middle, there was the cab driver, an African-American man, dead. He was kind of twisted, looking up at the night sky, but his eyes were closed. And the deputies told us that he had been stabbed 8 times. Now, this was the first time that I had ever seen a body outside of a funeral home. And it certainly was the first time that I'd ever seen someone killed through violence. It was horrific for me, and I wanted to keep distance. So I just kept my eye to the viewfinder of the camera, and I took picture after picture after picture of the dead man. And I knew full well that none of these pictures would ever be printed in a newspaper. At that time, those kinds of pictures would have been considered too gruesome. About this time, the medical examiner showed up, and he looked at the body, examined the man, and then he did something. He unbuckled the man's trousers, the belt, he lowered the trousers. He took a scalpel and he made an incision in the man's abdomen. And from his bag, he took out a meat thermometer, and he inserted that meat thermometer into the dead man. And this was the way that he measured body temperature and calculated how long the man had been dead. Now, the through the looking glass moment came later at the inquest. I wasn't there, but Kathy told me about it. The medical examiner testified that the man had died from 9 stab wounds. And Kathy reminded me, no. there were only 8 stab wounds. The 9th incision had been made by the medical examiner himself, and he had forgotten, under oath, had forgotten. Well, I couldn't get that out of my mind. Didn't know if I wanted to get that out of my mind. And was kind of unsure about if I would be a good reporter or not. Kathy felt sure that I would be. As I said, I had my doubts. The deadlines were stressful, and I didn't like asking the tough questions that you had to ask. I didn't have to ask grieving parents how it felt when they had just lost a son in a swimming accident. I could imagine how they felt. But I stuck it out. I stayed 3 months at the Playground Daily News, and at the end, I went back to school, spent another quarter studying journalism, and at the end of that quarter, went back to the Playground Daily News for another 3 months. And throughout my second and third year at university, I repeated this cycle: work, study, work, study. And altogether, I spent about a year working at the Playground Daily News and met dozens of interesting characters. Like the time I interviewed Tiny Tim. Tiny Tim was going to go on stage with his ukulele in his black suit with his stringy hair, and he was going to sing in his falsetto voice, Tiptoe Through the Tulips, for an audience of drunk and rowdy rednecks. Now, that truly was a through the looking glass moment, but maybe I'll keep that story for another night. Thank you for listening.